Richard Nixon also believed in the idea that while you had this massive counterculture movement, this anti war sentiment, the silent majority of Americans supported more conservative, middle class ideas that wanted to reduce federal involvement in everyday local affairs. And that's oftentimes a big mantra for conservatives and those in the Republican or Libertarian parties who believe in a reduction of federal government so as to reduce federal oversight and tyranny. Okay? Um, but in doing so, Richard Nixon, once he got into office, actually began a process of continuing some of the liberal programs that JFK and LBJ had espoused. So, while yes, he decreased some of the Great Society outreaches, he further continued, though, some of the other things that would lead towards more of a progressive mindset, such as an expansion of the EPA and other environmental concerns and other things of that nature, but then also other things that would improve the plight of poor and downtrodden and otherwise. And part of it was um, during the Nixon era, you saw a number of different Supreme Court cases that were deemed as having been targeted towards improving minorities. For example, um, if you have ever been arrested, or if you have ever watched a TV show where somebody was getting arrested and the police officer says, you have the right to remain silent, you have the right to a court appointed attorney, blah, 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 blah. Those are called your Miranda rights. Okay? Basically, that was a result of the Supreme Court case Miranda versus Arizona, where a gentleman named Miranda was arrested and basically he wasn't able to defend himself. So, under the Fifth Amendment, you have the right so as not to incriminate yourself. Okay? That's somewhere of an extension of that. So, that's where that comes from. So, if you've ever been arrested, I know some of you out there have, or maybe if you've ever seen that on TV, you're getting read the rights. That's what it is. You have the right to remain silent. Okay? Um, a lot of those different types of court cases, and then obviously leading towards Roe versus Wade as well. Um, Escobedo versus Illinois was enacted in the 60s. Basically, you have the right to request an attorney before talking to police if you're questioned. Okay. A lot of those Supreme Court cases were actually enacted by people in the Supreme Court, and those decisions were rendered by a more liberal Supreme Court. A lot of the American public, especially in the middle class, didn't like that as much. And that's one of the reasons why they wanted Richard Nixon in there, so he can appoint people who can help the middle class. As though they saw it. I think there are other motives there. You can decide for yourself what they may be. But otherwise, though, he appoints several different Supreme Court justices during his presidency that are more moderate in their tone. His extremist type guys that he may have wanted weren't going to get support from the Senate. So he appoints various different moderates that eventually obtain their approval from the Senate. Now, of course, Richard Nixon has an opportunity to rerun for president in 1972. A few different things happen as a result of this election, but one of the things that comes out about his opponents is that George Wallace rears his head again. And he runs as a Democrat. Of course, Nixon's a Republican. George Wallace is a very conservative Democrat. And the liberal wing of the Democratic Party doesn't really see eye to eye with him. So George McGovern will obtain the nomination from the Democratic Party. He's a senator from South Dakota who you wouldn't expect to be as liberal as he was, but he was for the time. Obtains the nomination. And then George Wallace splits off basically and splits the vote in essence. So that basically splits Democratic power. That also said, Richard Nixon still was quite popular. And in the 1972 election, he won almost 61% of the popular vote. And that was enough to earn him 520 electoral votes. You need 271 to win the nomination. He had almost twice that many. Okay? Um, 520 to 17. That's a massive landslide in the Electoral College. Okay? That was basically seen as a mandate that what Richard Nixon had been doing throughout his administration was what the American people wanted. And if you look at the way the votes went, he is absolutely right. Okay? So, George McGovern didn't cover much of the country except for just a few states like Massachusetts and whatnot. Okay? That was a sound thrashing in that election. Okay? But there were some other things that were going to happen in this era that were out of Nixon's control. And then there are some other things in this era that he caused. We'll talk about that in the next film. Otherwise, though, the economy had been struggling for a little while. After the Johnson administration, spending had been increased. Other things had gotten out of control. In the late 60s, there was some inflation. One of the classic things to do to stifle inflation is to cut spending and to increase your taxes a little bit. Okay? And that worked for a short time being. As a matter of fact, in 1969, the United States government had a surplus. Nice, right? Okay. It's not always a good thing. But OPEC continued to rear its head in the 70s. Remember, they wanted to punish all Western nations that supported Israel, Western Europe and the United States, by not sending them oil. Okay? So for several months in 1973 and 74, there was that oil embargo that caused a massive gasoline shortage in the United States. Eventually it would be alleviated. But the price of oil went from about $3 a barrel to about $15 a barrel. It's a 500% increase in that time. That's massive. You have very long lines. Price of oil is going up, which invariably means that other things are going up. So you have an oil shortage, and whatever is there, prices are going up because there's hardly any of it. That's a double whammy right there. Okay? So, also, manufacturing was going to be a little bit different as well. You see, there were emerging responses after World War II to rebuild the Japanese and French economies. And eventually, Japan would increase its manufacturing or output rather, and they would become a massive economic engine. Okay? To this day, quite a number of things that are innovated are as a result of Japanese innovation. Okay? If you've ever driven a Japanese car, you see Sony TVs and radios and all kinds of different things. Okay? Japan has its footprint all over technology. And I had a Honda Accord for 14 and a half years. I replaced that Honda with another Honda. Okay? They're exceptionally reliable. They get great mileage. They have good power. They're safe. And they're not super expensive. That's a fantastic combination. That's why you see so many Honda Accords on the roads, and Toyotas and you know, so many different things. Japan makes great products. Okay? They become a manufacturing competitor for the United States, and often they can outprice the United States. And that sometimes, okay, the high wage and high employment industry in the United States begins to start taking a hit. You start seeing that dominance disappear on the side of the Americans. Okay? So you have manufacturing going down. You have an increased awareness for energy independence, if you will. We need to rely less on the Middle East for oil. That was the sentiment at the time. We still rely on the Middle East, although the United States has ramped up oil output so much that we often export our own oil too. Okay. Um, as it stands, very early May 2020, the price of oil has come shockingly down because of the pandemic situations and OPEC flooding the market so as to perhaps drown out some of its international competitors. That's good for the consumer in the short run. We pay less for gas, but none of us are driving a whole lot of places anyway because we're all at home, right? Okay. In the meantime, the energy sector has taken a massive hit. And in the state of Texas, where oil and gas are critically important to our economy, it's important that there be a rebound. So there's a balance in there somewhere. Ideally speaking, a barrel of oil from a balanced perspective should cost about $70, $75, somewhere around there. If you have a barrel of oil at $75, you can keep gasoline prices hovering around $2 a gallon. So consumers are reasonably happy, and manufacturers and refiners and otherwise, they're profitable. That's a good balance. It's not sustainable when oil is dirt cheap, just like it's not sustainable when it's sky high. Okay? That was something being recognized at that time. And the Nixon administration sought to do things with it, just oftentimes without concrete ideas.